Hello and welcome to this week's Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel podcast. It's your host, Umpire James, and this week we get to hear from Umpire Swense, who is fairly new to the IKS community but has already entered with a big splash with a number of games that he has started and completed and hosted. He's gotten through quite a few already. So we're here to talk about one of his games that recently completed and and learn about that. So thank you for joining us today, Swence.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Good. So before we get into the game itself, do you, I guess, give a little bit of background, whatever you want to share about yourself, who you are, what got you into wargaming, how you found the IKS, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I came to IKS through less of a wargaming route actually. I was someone who was kind of a forever DM, so to speak, in my friends' tabletop RPG groups, and over time we'd gotten more into sort of strategy and bigger, more less personal campaigns, more stories about, say, a city under siege or a kingdom going through a succession crisis. And that kind of led me to look into what resources are available for running campaigns, for simulating military engagements, that sort of thing. And gonna be honest, most of the original stuff that I found early on in my search was pretty dire. It was stuff sort of intended to abstract military resolution for people otherwise interested mostly in tabletop RPG gaming. But then, just by sort of luck and happenstance, as I was looking around at this, I came across the original I'm gonna say this completely wrong. The Rice Fits, is it? Um,
Yep.
Rules for and obviously those have a lot of flaws. But I started sitting there and thinking, man, I could streamline this a lot down. But wait, let me not see if I'm reinventing the wheel. And then I stumbled upon IKS, which had already invented the wheel, so to speak. I think I started off playing a couple of your live games. Had a blast. Thought the double blind system was really interesting, and then from there, I decided that it would be fun to get into umpiring. I did some assistant umpiring for you. Kind of got my feet wet doing that, and then realized that the play by post format was more what I wanted to pursue in terms of umpiring, and so that's when I started with this, my first game that I ran. That was really just a test to see how how umpiring would be, as a solo umpire running a play by post. So
hmm That's interesting. Your background's very similar to my own in terms of your path to the IKS. That's actually funny. Well, it's cool. Well, we're glad you found us and are now hosting games. So let's talk about this game. I think one thing for me. So I guess I'll give this disclaimer. I was in this game. I was actually CIC on one of the sides, and if the audience hasn't realized yet, I always run AAR. If there's any game that I win in as the CIC, those are the ones that I pick to host for the podcast because I'm highlighting my amazingness. But not well. It just happened to be that this one and the Desert Fox's Kane were ones I've recently done. I hope that's not actually a true trend, but maybe it is. But no, I was in this game. It was really fun, and one thing I liked about it in particular is it was a completely, it's a map and a scenario that aren't historical at all. It's not well known, so it was made up, and for me that made it a lot more fun. So why don't you tell us about how you came up with it and where you came up with the scenario?
sure, yeah. So I guess coming from a sort of more role playing game background, I felt very comfortable sort of operating in that imagined world setting where, and I didn't want to make too detailed of a setting. I didn't want to drown everyone in notes about the background of these sides, but I wanted sort of simple, evocative red versus blue sides that had enough meat on the bones that it wasn't just I am this anonymous, faceless character operating in a as on the blue team fighting the red team. I wanted there to be enough meat that players could kind of get invested, could pick a side, and kind of feel some attachment to it. So that's why I went with this idea that there was a civil war between royalists and republicans, and initially there was nothing really fleshed out beyond that. There was just one side that supported a monarchy and another side that supported parliament. And in terms of the sort of the tactical side of things, I thought it would be really fun to like you said, pick something that just I really hoped at least my audience would have almost zero familiarity with uh, in terms of a map, in terms of a climate, in terms of just everything. Haiti is pretty close to the United States, where I think a pretty big population of Kriegsspielers is from. But at the same time, I think people's general familiarity with wars in Haiti and the history of Haiti is, relatively less. And, as much as I love Gettysburg and Antietam and, having grown up in Maryland, I'm really familiar with all the Civil War battlefields and whatnot. And I could honestly look at a map of Gettysburg, for forever. But I wanted to give people a different challenge and really kind of force people to think outside the box with a map that they hadn't seen. And shout out to the IKS website because they had a link to the Library of Congress maps of Haiti on it. And as I was scrolling through, I saw the Haitian maps. I found one that had a what I thought was an interesting collection of terrain, and yeah, went from there. Whipped up some quick orders of battle, and yeah,
Interesting. Okay. So let's why don't you go ahead and just describe in 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes, what happened? Yeah, what was this scenario itself, and what happened in the game from beginning to end?
yeah, sure. So it is a little hard. This is what you're looking at right now is well, as you know, pretty much the ending of the game. There was uh, what the players were initially confronted with when they first saw this map was the Republicans' objectives were to take this city here and this city here, Dessalines and Des Dunes, and the they could come in anywhere at the bottom of the map, and the royalists could start anywhere above. I think it was the 26th kilometer parallel, which is this line here. Um, so it was really broad and open ended in terms of what either side could do, how they could deploy, and you know I wanted to do that intentionally because this isn't a setting that was sort of pre-made. There's no real history to it. I wanted to give players the option to be sort of creative in how they deployed, to look at this with fresh eyes and not really have any expectations about where they should be starting or what the best battlefield on the map is or where I wanted it to essentially be from scratch. And so the Republicans very quickly put together this plan that was I think shout out to James. You're 2IC, who I believe labeled every ford on the map based on my very vague rules about where rivers could be forded. Um,
Hmm.
and so this river down here in the south is fordable in loads of places, but then there's this river up north which only basically is fordable here or crossable here at the Pont d'Estrée. I'm gonna butcher all the French in this, but There's a bridge here, basically. There's another ford over here, and then there was one ford up here in the north. So the northern river, the Lestre, was extremely difficult to cross, and the bottom river was an obstacle, but not a significant obstacle. So what the royalists basically decided to do was march almost as far to the west as they could, snaking up through this forest here, all the way up and around, past this town called Druin, and then around in a big flank march. By contrast, the royalist side basically deployed um, to guard one of the only. There's really only two functioning roads in this on this map. There's a lot of small trails, but there's this one main road that goes up to the bridge, and another main road that snakes along the hills to the east. Um, James, that maybe you could talk a little more about why the Republicans picked the side that they did. I think they could have picked either side and probably had some good success, but the Republicans picked to march up the west, and the Royalists basically concentrated around the town of Villard, in a double line, with one line in Boudet and then one in Villard coming around here, anchored on the river and the lake. Very much anticipating a march smack up the center, and that was a really good, I think, defensive position. If in some way they had to defend something behind that position, but I mean, the truth is they had to defend this whole large space, and the big royalist failure was not really scouting, really expecting the advance to come up the center, and that was compounded by the fact that Desert Fox, who was commanding a detachment of the Republican cavalry, rode straight up the center per James's orders as the Republican commander. Just was a massive distraction for maybe an hour or two in game time before riding off to meet the main Republican column. So that really, that sort of combination of their own preconceived assumption that they had to defend this central stretch, combined with Desert Fox's feint, basically committed for most of the first day of the battle. Republicans did not move from the Boudet to Villard area. They basically just sat tight and did a little bit of scouting off to the west, or excuse me, the east. Did a little bit of scouting out to the rivers down here. Eventually sent someone up to Dessalines, maybe halfway through the day. Um, and then, but really just were very fixed. They had a few scouts in the vicinity of Bakhtiakin, some of whom actually were got busy building this little fortress down here, which played no role in the battle, but was a good way to keep everyone busy and occupied and having a good time, I guess. The Yeah, so by the time they had any inkling of what the enemy was doing, the royalists, and I think they saw some royalist cavalry up around Druin, but by that point um, the royalists had already made it to Des Dunes here. Or sorry, the Republicans had already made it to Des Dunes here. Were marching on the bridge, and very quickly were able to intercept the Republican or the Royalist ground lines of communication, which in the Royalist briefing were said to run from the north here to the bridge and then down to the lagoon down here. So basically, by the first day, the Republicans had totally gotten behind the Royalists, and the Royalists were only learning about it as essentially the sun was going down. they they did realize, the, the trouble that they were in, that Des Dunes had been taken, and knowing, I think, that they wanted to defend Dessalines, which they knew was not occupied, the Royalists moved a lot of their better troops up to here, between this little pass between the river and the mountains, and this there's a small creek here. You can't really see all that well, but there's a small creek with houses and trees that makes a pretty good obstacle, and the Royalists set up a defensive position basically in between those two, which I think overall was a good way to block Dessalines. Unfortunately for them, and this was sort of a theme throughout the battle, the Royalist communication between players was just never as smooth and never as efficient as the Republicans. The Republicans generally all stayed within almost line of sight of each other the whole time. Where set, the commander, the Royalist the excuse me, the Republican commander was doing a good job bouncing around between commands, checking in with everyone. Uh, that's James. But the Royalists, by contrast, were doing a lot of dispatches that, just due to how spread out they were by the time Royalist forces were all the way up here and then all the way down here still, those messages were taking a long time to arrive. People weren't really clear on what was going on, and the Royalist commander called for everyone basically to leave their commands and meet up by the lagoon to have a big conference. And that was, I think, one of the more disastrous things that happened for the Royalist side, because the Republicans, who I don't think knew that this had happened, nevertheless caught sight of the forces situated at Paso Roche, and then crossed here at this river, and were able to attack with comparatively overwhelming force, roll up and rout a big chunk of the Royalist best troops, and then by the time that the Royalists had uh, gotten back and responded to that, the Republicans were already pulling back across the river to this pretty good defensive position that they have running from Des Dunes to the Pont to this ford here. And that was basically what would set the stage for the next day. Um, Day two began with overnight, the Royalists decided to do this big attenuate flank march all the way overnight, from the lagoon with all of their militia and their militia cavalry to Medell, where in the morning they would launch this very ill-fated assault against the dug-in enemy holding Des Dunes, while attacking in the center at the same time. And I'm being a little reductive here. There was a little more sort of thought and strategy that went into it. So maybe I'm not being entirely fair to the Royalist side, but and I don't think it was necessarily a terrible plan. But dividing their forces like this really just ensured that neither side would have the force to actually achieve their objective, and the Republicans found it pretty easy to shunt forces between each of these two defensive positions. So basically, they pulled a bunch of forces off the Pont, sent them to Des Dunes, destroyed this attack. Then the Republicans turned right back around, and the battle ends with General Bellardi's First Division, which was played very well by Barcos, slamming into the to the left side of this giant Republican or Royalist assault on the bridgehead, which just really never got off the ground because of how long the Republicans had to fortify everything. And that was essentially the battle in a nutshell. A special shout out has to go to Octavius for really, I think, astutely handling after his allies broke near Passaroche on the first day. He was able to stabilize the situation there, and then he was able to do a pretty good job preventing uh, Suarez, who's Adam's freelancer, from ever making any real push on Dessalines. So he did well there. Ultimately, it really wasn't enough because of how battered the troops had been from the first day of fighting, and these really well put together defenses that I mean, the Royalists just gave the Republicans way too long to set things up, essentially with complete impunity in their backyard, and that was I think ultimately what was the deciding factor in the battle. Um, that really bad initial scouting failure that allowed the Republicans to um, who I think always had a much better understanding of the terrain and where they wanted to hold and where they wanted to fight than the Royalists did. Were able to sneak around behind, get everyone into position, build the defenses, all basically without any interruption or any real chance of anyone interfering with their progress until it was far too late.
Yeah, it was a very good game. What rule set did you use for it, or did you make your own?
So I used basically I used your rule set, your D6 rule set.
Oh, okay.
The only addition that I added to it was I did track um and I did relatively early on. I decided to start doing this. I did start tracking casualties, and this kind of actually goes into one thing that I would have definitely done differently. Is I don't know how well you guys can see this, but I picked probably just the most confusing way of tracking disruption and casualties, using markers that I think many players associate with disruption, these colored numbers
Hmm.
to track casualties, and then using these pieces which work perfectly well for tracking disruption, but red is actually the lightest level of disruption, and that I learned after the game actually threw some players off that the colors went from red, basically dark red, to lighter and lighter colors as the unit got more disrupted, and that threw people off. So I've since switched up, and I'm now using the colored numbers to represent disruption, and a different just little number piece to represent casualties. But the main reason I tracked casualties was one, for my own sort of edification, and two, in the event that a unit just had persistently taken enough bad hits, sixes and fives on that D6 system, I wanted it to start, reflecting that that unit wasn't going to rally as quickly, or might not rally at all if they'd taken too many casualties to really be combat effective anymore.
Okay, interesting. Besides a different use of markers, what other learnings did you take from umpiring this game that you're going to apply in other games or have already applied?
Yeah, I think one big thing that I learned from this was um, that you really have to pay, I think, pretty diligent attention to the way that you're describing um, the full sensory experience, because the visual element, the players can see what they have, uh, and they can kind of see things, but um, I wasn't always the best with accurately or very coherently explaining to people the sounds that they heard, and that's one thing that I really, by the late game, was focusing on, because early on I would just say you hear cannon fire from the east, sort of vaguely, and um, I realized that a lot of times those kind of comments were getting me the most follow up, so I started focusing in more on making sure that I was giving clear descriptions of what was seen, what was heard, things that players might be able to see that they couldn't necessarily see from the map, that sort of thing. Really, really trying to work to put them in a mental image of what they were experiencing, and I think that that's just something that also kind of comes with time um and getting a better feel for writing updates.
Okay. Anything else?
Um, one thing, I guess this isn't so much a thing that I learned, but that I've been having fun with about this setting is that I think by giving players little sort of tidbits and little pieces of background and history, and I think this is applicable to historical games too, you can really get people more involved with these kind of little world building uh, hints or notes that you don't even necessarily have to explain too much. If you're kind of alluding to things that happened in the past, alluding to relationships between characters, alluding to these kinds of things, I think you can really I think you can really like draw players in and really get them invested in their side, in their setting, and now as I've continued running games that are kind of sequels to this one, it's been really enjoyable to see how players have built up a sort of a mythos, and it's also kind of funny because when new players come into one of the games that's set in this setting, they always ask, well, where's like the lore document? Where's the background document? And unfortunately, there really isn't one because everything is basically just the collaborative, players on the royalist side, players on the Republican side, kind of yes-anding things that I've said and building sort of a coherent setting out of that, which I think is a really cool exercise in collaborative world building, even if which is going a little beyond what Kriegsspiel was originally kind of made to do, but is honestly just really fun. Part of what keeps me coming back to umpire more games and keeps me really enthusiastic about this setting and running more battles in it.
Oh, good. So I know you've already started and in some cases completed a few games since this one. So why don't you share what other games have you run or are you running or plan to run in the near future?
Yeah, so we just wrapped up, or I just wrapped up the Battle of Calanicum, which James was briefly in before getting lanced in the face.
Yep.
Um, the which that was a battle from the Roman Persian Wars. It was very quick. It was I think a 5 turn battle. Which was intentional on my part because I think a lot of times with some of the ancient battles, so much is decided just by the initial disposition of forces that I like kind of getting to run these as little popcorn play by posts where there's no expectation that the game's going to go a long time. So much of it really is dependent on that initial deployment, but then you still get to make decisions that impact how things work along the way. And in that game, the Romans deployed really too close to the river, and the Persians, very similarly to history, just did a massive sweeping left flank charge that wrapped up the Roman side and dealt with them pretty quickly. But yeah, that was a lot of fun to run. Right now, I'm running 2 games, one of which is sort of coming to a climactic inflection point. I don't want to say too much about it because it is ongoing right now. And I don't want to give away anything in case anyone's listening in and hoping for clues. That's called the Golf March, and that's a battle that it's a couple irregular Republican forces against this giant, very well equipped Royalist column that's just trying to get from one side of the map to the other, while the Republicans slow it down as much as possible. And that's kind of a side quill, or I guess you could call it a sequel to this game that I'm running, or that I ran, the Dessalines battle that we've been talking about. And the one that I'm most excited for, and that I hope everyone who hasn't gotten a playing spot spectates and follows, is I'm running this battle called the Peninsular Campaign, which uh, Wolfton drew a massive map of the southern peninsula of Haiti that we're going to be using to depict this huge operational campaign between hundreds of thousands of troops. And I think that's going to be a lot like this battle in that players haven't really seen the map yet before, and in fact, still haven't really seen the map because I haven't given them the good map. I've given them these crummy old colonial maps of Haiti that they have to use and try to suss out what's happening. So that I think that's going to be really fun, and it's a chance to kind of uh, test out my attempt at building an operational system, and also a chance to explore this world a little bit more and give players a challenge that is very unfamiliar. That is has its own topography and its own challenges, and attrition due to disease as a big factor given the tropical climate and things like that. So that's what I've got coming up, and that's the one that I'm most looking forward to, and I'm really trying to hype up right now.
Interesting. Yeah, those all are and sound like good games. I will say something I meant to say earlier. One thing that you did well in this game, I thought, was you did a good job giving written descriptions of what happened. I think it was on the level of Ruse and the Gobbler in terms of being engaging and informative. So you did a really good job with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean that's I think one of the more beneficial sides to doing play by post is that I can really take my time. I can really just sit down and spend an afternoon writing everyone's descriptions, reading them back over, making sure I didn't miss anything. And that's what I love the most about play by post as a format, and why I try to recommend it to anyone who pops in the new umpire channel and says, "Hey, I'm interested in umpiring." Well, I think that this is a good way to hone your skills with no particular time crunch and really get a good feel for how to umpire without that time pressure of kind of managing 10 to 15 people in a live format for the first time. You can kind of already have a feel for how you like to umpire, the systems you like to use, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. As we conclude, any final parting thoughts from you, or anything I failed to ask that you wish I had?
Um, let's think. I, hmm. I don't know. I mean, my only parting thought is, I'd encourage anyone listening to this, pop into the Peninsula campaign, Kriegsspiel, watch it, spectate it. There's going to be chances for spectator interaction in the game, so it isn't entirely a passive spectating experience unless you want it to be. And yeah, I just look forward to keeping giving back to this community. I mean, I've met a lot of great people here, and I've learned just an inordinate amount about history. It's been an absolute blast being a part of this community, and I'm just looking forward to staying a part of it and running games.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking your time with me this Sunday, and thank you for hosting so many awesome games. And keep it up. Don't burn yourself out. And looking forward to everything you're going to be running.
Sounds great. Thanks.
All right. Thanks to those who listened. Hope you enjoyed, whether it was live here. We had a few with us here live, and then I'll post it on YouTube here right now. So thanks for those watching. We'll see you next week. Bye. Yeah.